Welcome back to our discussions of neuroscience. We're going to talk right now about the cerebral cortex, which is basically the big bulk, most of the brain that we're going to talk about. Give you an overview. This is fairly easy to look at picture of how the brain is divided up into different lobes. Of course, there are the left and right hemispheres, which are the two halves of the brain. The frontal lobe is easy, it's at the front. The temporal lobes are behind the temples. The parietal lobe is sort of at the top and at the back, and at the very back, right, that little notch at the back of your head, is what's called the occipital lobe. We'll first talk about some of the various structures in the cerebral cortex, and then talk about their functions. This is basically the same view, but from the middle of the cortex looking out. So we can see the frontal lobe wraps around these subcortical structures we talked about previously. The hippocampus, thalamus, amygdala, all those things are beneath the cortex here. So here we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe is down here, and then the occipital lobe is here at the back. Corpus callosum is a critical structure in the human brain. It's what connects the two hemispheres or halves of the cerebral cortex. The corpus callosum is composed entirely of axons. You can see these are very thick bundles of nerves connecting the two hemispheres. So lots of information that travels back and forth across the two hemispheres. This is the part of the brain that is severed in what's called a split brain operation. So this part right here in the middle is the corpus callosum, and in some cases of severe epilepsy, the corpus callosum will be severed or just partially severed to treat that severe epilepsy. The two hemispheres, while they work together in a normal patient, we have to keep in mind that they are specialized and they are asymmetrical. That is, the right side of the brain, of course, controls the left side of the body, and of course the left side of the brain controls the right. For vision, it's a little more complicated. Rather than our right eye or our left eye, it's our right visual field. So if you're looking at a point in space, everything to the right goes to the left hemisphere, and everything to the left goes to the right. So it's important to keep in mind. There are a variety of studies that have looked at split brain patients and what happens when you present something in the right visual field, which of course goes to the left hemisphere, or what happens when you do the opposite. We'll see some various cases where it's important to understand that. Now, for most people, different tasks or abilities are lateralized. That is, they are in one hemisphere or the other. For right-handed people, most of us have our language comprehension and production accomplished in the left hemisphere, while things like object and face recognition and some other tasks are accomplished in the right hemisphere. Now, for people who are left-handed, they tend to be less asymmetrical. That is, sometimes language is in both sides of the brain, and so there is some advantage to being left-handed, because it's possible that your abilities are spread throughout the brain rather than just on one side or another. To get into the specific substructures within each lobe, the frontal lobe is important for motor functions and our executive functioning, things like attention. The prefrontal area is this part right above your eyes. This is a very important part for understanding our consciousness, executive functioning. This is also what's most likely to be injured in a head injury, particularly in an automobile accident. What will happen is if you come to a sudden stop like you do in an accident, it's not that you hit your head, it's that your brain hits the front of your skull because it's basically floating in fluid. And that's what tends to cause damage to those prefrontal areas. So the functions accomplished here are attention, working memory, some of our personality, and memory retrieval. So to take a look at an actual brain, we can see the different parts of the brain, and these outcroppings are called the gyrus. And oftentimes, we'll talk about a specific function being in a specific part of one of these gyri, or gyruses. We're going to talk mostly about the motor areas, which is in the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal cortex. This is where motion is executed, and it has a very similar layout to the somatosensory area, which is in the next part of the brain, back in the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe, which is here, is involved in complex tasks. mathematics, spatial reasoning, our perception of motion, and this is also where the primary somatosensory cortex is. So the part of the brain that processes our sense of touch and what we call proprioception, which tells us where our limbs are in 3D space. So again, this is going to be in this part of the brain, and this postcentral gyrus, which is this squiggly thing right here, is the somatosensory cortex. As you can see, the somatosensory cortex and motor cortex are located adjacent to one another and have similar mapping. So the sensory part of the tongue is right next to the motor part for the tongue: lips, eyes, hands, heads, etc. So the primary motor area and the primary somatosensory area. The occipital lobe at the back of the brain, all it tends to do is vision. It's where the primary visual cortex is. There is cortical mapping of visual space in this area. Lots of pre-processing of vision occurs in this part of the brain. The temporal lobes are involved in language production and comprehension, so semantic knowledge, memory storage, face recognition, and object recognition. In fact, there's a specific part of the brain called the fusiform face gyrus, which is responsible for processing visual information in faces and recognizing a person's face. Damage to the temporal lobes can cause different kinds of amnesia, both retrograde and anterograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is loss of previous memories. Anterograde amnesia is an inability to create new memories. Agnosia is an interesting disorder in which people lose the ability to recognize visual objects. So hold up a set of keys, the person won't be able to tell you what they are. Interesting discussion of that in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. So again, this is the temporal lobe. The primary auditory cortex is located sort of underneath in the temporal lobe. It's kind of hard to see here, but that's processed in the temporal lobe as well. Now, that's basic anatomy. Let's take a look at some of the functional areas. We've already talked a little bit about some of these functional areas like vision and touch, and taste, and hearing, and smell. We'll start first with the sensory areas. The somatosensory cortex is this part of the brain in the postcentral gyrus and the parietal lobe, which receives input from our muscles and skin. It's laid out in what's called a homunculus, or map of the body and our skin. It's really important to understand about this is there isn't equal representation of cortex to parts of the body. As you can see, your entire arm, shoulder, head, neck, trunks, and hips take up less space than does your face. It's the reason why when you get a cut on your face or your fingers or here, tongue, any of that, it's going to be particularly painful because there's so much brain associated with that area. This is what we call cortical magnification. Easy way to demonstrate this is through what's called the two-point threshold. And this is your ability to determine that 2 points represent two separate points and not one point. In fact, if you do this on your shoulder, your 2-point threshold is about 3 or 4 inches, whereas on your tip of your fingers, it's less than a 1/16 of an inch. So it's important to understand that process as well. So if we were actually built the same way our brains were, this is what we'd look like, which would be kind of funky. The other sensory areas are, of course, the visual cortex back at the occipital lobe, the auditory cortex beneath the temporal lobe, and the olfactory bulb and gustatory cortex are very small in humans. We have very poor senses of smell and taste. So again, to give you an idea where some of those are. You can see the parts of the brainstem that are responsible for some of these sensory processes. Here's the auditory cortex, the olfactory bulb here, and the olfactory turricural and the olfactory cortex. Very small structures here. And again, motor and sensory cortices. Motor cortex is comprised of 3 areas: the primary motor cortex, the supplementary motor cortex, and the premotor cortex. And essentially, these are involved in all of our motor processes. So if you're going to try to catch a ball, the premotor cortex is going to get information from the visual system to plan the motor plans through the supplementary and primary motor cortex. The neocortex, which again is the newest part of the brain in terms of evolution, is also known as the association areas. Essentially, it's the rest of the cortex that are not involved in senses, and all our higher order functions are carried out here. Things like language. Of course, we have language processing. This is an example of how we might read. Information comes into the primary visual area through the angular gyrus to Wernicke's area, which allows us to understand language, and then Broca's area, which allows us to create language, that is, to speak. Neocortex is also where we are able to see and understand things, that is, recognize objects. In the visual cortex, we have what are called the what versus where pathways. What is color, size, and detail. Where is location and motion. And this is how we're going to be able to discern what and where something is. So that's a very brief introduction to cortex. Read on if you want to find out more about that. We're going to be visiting these areas when we talk about how drugs affect specific parts of the cortex.